My name is Peter Ratcliff. I specialise in dendrochronological tests on the soundboards of musical instruments, and in particular those of the violin family. Like many of my colleagues, I have a particularly keen interest, not to say a mild obsession, about the dendrochronology of the Messiah. I suppose this is a reaction to years of listening to comments and unsupported allegation regarding the methods and the dendrochronological results found and published by John Topham and Derek McCormack, and subsequently confirmed by the team of dendrochronologists led by Professor Henry Grissino-Meyer. Following the recent conference on the Messiah in Oxford, I wanted to expand on some of the general and specific points put forward by John Topham in his presentation. I want to demonstrate that using accepted, current dendrochronological cross-matching methods, that the results of these tests offer the most compelling forensic evidence that the wood on the soundboard of the Messiah is totally and specifically compatible with the wood on some other instruments made at the same time, therefore in the first quarter of the 18th century. Ultimately, it is not my job to confirm the attribution of the Messiah to Antonio Stradivari, but bear in mind that the Messiah was attributed to Strad long before any of the dendrochronological tests and results that I'm going to talk about. In fact, I will demonstrate that it is next to impossible for any of these results to have occurred by chance. The few people who do dendro research on instruments today have substantially more data than were available when Peter Klein and subsequently John Topham and Henry Grissino-Meyer analysed the Messiah back in the late 1990s. And I suspect, had the wood of the Messiah been tested today for the first time, I believe with current databases, none of the controversies, at least regarding the dendro results, would have followed. What I propose to do is therefore a brand new, fresh, cross-matching analysis of the wood, as if it had never been done before. I'm not going to concern myself too much about the actual dates of this wood at this stage, but much more on which of the ring patterns from my database this wood correlates to. The process of testing the wood involves three elements. Firstly, we need a sample, which is, in our case, the tree ring pattern of both sides of the front of the Messiah. A ring pattern can be described as the successive widths of the annual rings on a piece of wood, starting at the oldest, nearer to the centre of the tree, to the most recent ring situated below the bark. On the Messiah violin, like on many instruments with a two-piece front, the oldest tree rings are situated at the edges and the youngest ones at the centre joint. We then of course need a reference database to compare the sample to. The extent of this database is the most important element in an analysis. It is vital to understand its significance. What is this database? Firstly, to be meaningful, a database has to be as wide-ranging as possible and contain ring patterns from thousands of instruments, irrespective of age and provenance. A partial database, for example, only containing specific batches of instruments such as Italian 18th century instruments, or limited to other groups of French or German or English from any given period, or indeed limited to available published data, would be totally inadequate. Our database, built up over the last 15 years, now includes instruments made as early as the 16th century, such as lutes, early bowed and plucked instruments right through to the wood used in current instrument production, in other words, modern wood. Not to mention countless pieces of unworked timber, both modern and old. To complicate matters, some tone wood dealers occasionally source and sell old wood, as some modern, not just modern makers, actually do and have used old timber when they can procure it. I also have many ring patterns recovered from reclaimed wood from many old buildings, mostly from, but not exclusively, alpine locations. The database also contains what is generally known as master or regional chronologies. Many of these are published and all come from known geographical locations. They include data from living trees and often timber from nearby buildings of earlier periods. Combining data from these different periods pushes the starting date of these chronologies back in time. This process is done to compile long and representative ring patterns for specific areas and specific species. And thousands of these invaluable references have been made available by researchers through the International Tree Ring Data Bank, which, for many dendrochronologists, form the backbone of their analyses. When it comes to testing musical instruments, however, these published references are often inadequate and without question require the additional valuable resources the ring patterns from the soundboards of musical instruments can offer. So essentially, this is a vast, constantly expanding database and as far as practicable, comprehensive. The third component required is software to help identify possible relationships between a sample and the database. It is important to understand what goes on within this software in order to demonstrate the objectivity of the results. What is also crucial to understand is that a test for a supposed Stradivari is not done exclusively against data from other Stradivari. It is carried out against every single dataset in the entire database, which contains these thousands of ring patterns from instruments and other sources. I cannot stress this point enough, as it really is the most compelling aspect of the analysis of the wood on the Messiah. So every single reference will obtain a result. In fact, every single one will obtain dozens, if not hundreds, of results. The reason for this is that our sample is tested not only at one position against any given reference, but at every point of overlap of the two. So if we have a specific reference spanning maybe 400 years and our sample from the ring pattern of the Messiah, which itself extends to just under 100 rings, we will obtain a minimum of 300 results. And this is just for one reference, and again one out of thousands contained in the database. So if you multiply the number of results by the number of references, we have hundreds of thousands of results, and in fact the tests will generate over 1 million results. But what constitutes those results? Some of you may be familiar with a t-value, this statistical result we hear and read about in dendrochronological reports. But what is the t-value? Essentially, as far as the comparison of tree ring patterns, this t-value represents the significance of the statistical correlation between them. The point is, of course, out of these hundreds of thousands of t-values which have been calculated, the vast majority, due to their low level of significance, will not be taken into consideration, as their likelihood of representing a true temporal match would be virtually unprovable. Experience has shown that t-values below 4 can rarely be considered as significant. So the first paring down consists in eliminating all these low-level t-values. As these t-values increase, fewer and fewer positions for a sample fit along any given portion of any reference. However, when t-values reach 6 and above, they can seriously be considered as a true representation of a temporal match between series, meaning that the two trees grew at the same time. For the sake of objectivity, I will consider that none of the data contained in my database are actually dated, and will therefore treat each one as a series of floating data, of course representing tree ring measurements. What I'm therefore looking for in my results are any t-values above a certain level, irrespective of what data they refer to. Maybe regional references, timber recovered from old buildings, master chronology, or one or more of my thousands of ring patterns from musical instruments. Following the calculations of the t-values obtained against the whole database, we have therefore initially removed those with t-values below 4, which are actually the vast majority of the results and run in their tens and hundreds of thousands, and also discarded the ones referring to overlaps below 50 rings. We then end up with about 600 direct correlations. 600 out of about 1 million, therefore a relatively low number. Raising the t-value threshold to 5, however, this number is drastically cut to 63 direct correlations, and it is further reduced to 25 over a value of 5.5. In the great scheme of things, this is, compared to many analyses, a very small number of correlations indeed, indicating that we are in the presence of a challenging set of tree rings. Challenging in the sense that its specific pattern is unlike most in the database, and therefore very few references react to it significantly. Above a t-value of 6, a mere 10 ring patterns correlate with the bass side and 11 against the treble side of the Messiah. From our database, that is all that remains. Those 10 and 11 are the most significant results out of the million we started from. They have not been preselected or somehow prioritized from the database. They are the unbiased outcome of cold mathematical formula applied to each and every reference. So let's have a look at those remaining correlations and what they're referring to. Well, luck would have it that on the treble side we see correlations with the wood, either the bass, the treble, or both sides of 7 separate instruments. We don't actually see any regional chronologies or wood from sources other than the soundboards of musical instruments. I haven't removed any inconvenient correlations, maybe such as those obtained or not, as the case may be, from the wood from violin instruments. These are the raw results. So let's have a closer look at the treble side. The best result with the treble side was identified with half of the belly of a violin, also the treble side, surprise, surprise, of a Stradivarius known as the ex-Wilhelm. It is extremely unusual for an instrument from the Stradivari workshop to be made out of wood from different trees. But this violin, made in 1724, presents exactly this situation. Against data from the Messiah, we note a t-value of just over 11 between the two, unquestionably a strong result linking the two pieces, which, as mentioned, is the best result out of over 1 million. The plotted data in this graph of the matching pieces of wood show the undeniable relationship represented by this best overall correlation, whereby the two ring patterns or curves almost merge with each other. The relationship with this particular instrument, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most revealing of the whole analysis, as importantly it forms a material link between the wood of the Messiah and the workshop of Stradivari. Let me explain. The opposite side of the 1724 ex Wilhelm, therefore the bass side, as mentioned, was found to be unrelated to its counterpart treble side, meaning that its two halves came from separate trees. What was found, however, is that this bass side obtained its most significant results with wood on a number of other Stradivari using exactly the same cross-matching procedures as we have just described. Unlike its counterpart treble side and the wood on the Messiah, that piece of wood responded exceedingly well to cross-matching tests. Whereas the wood on the Messiah obtained a mere 11 results over a t-value of 6, the bass side of the ex-Wilhelm obtained over 600 above the same t-value threshold. And some of these proved to be very strong indeed, with the 5 most significant, all with t-values over 11, are with other separate violins by Stradivari, including 2 of the most famous of his instruments, namely the Titian and the Allard, both made in 1715. Now, considering the context of a busy violin making workshop in the early 18th century, such as that of Stradivari, and considering that these represent the most significant results, is it more likely that the wood of these 7 instruments, including the bass side of the ex-Wilhelm, came from 7 different trees, or that instead their wood all started life within the same tree? The statistical evidence as well as practicalities strongly support the second scenario, therefore linking the treble side of the Messiah to the treble side of the ex-Wilhelm, which in turn relates to the other violins by Stradivari. The next observation is that the results obtained between the 2 halves of the Messiah, which reached a t-value of 8.8, is significantly inferior to the one obtained between the 2 treble sides of the Messiah and the ex-Wilhelm, which, as we saw, had a t-value of about 11. Although there are some differences, I think we can reasonably assume that the 2 halves of the Messiah came from the same tree. We can therefore consider the possibility, which doesn't appear quite so remote now, that both the treble sides of the Messiah and that of the ex-Wilhelm came from one log. The comparison of the 2 graphs combined with a superior correlation between the 2 treble sides also demonstrates that the 2 pieces of wood were much more closely related within the log. What these specific sets of results from the ex-Wilhelm appear to do is to place two separate logs or parts of logs in the Stradivari workshop, one from which the soundboards of the Titian, the Allard, the Reifenberg, the Prove from 1718, the small Baroque violin Fontaine, and a further Stradivari from 1724, and finally the bass side of the ex-Wilhelm were made from. And the other log being the source of the other side of the ex-Wilhelm and the treble side of the Messiah, and by extension and all probabilities, its bass side as well. So I have now talked about the most significant result from our database, which was this treble side of the ex-Wilhelm violin. This example by itself, even if it was the only instrument to find a relationship with the Messiah wood, cannot be coincidental. But of course it is not the only one. Out of the 11 results originally found achieving T values of 6 and above, we see the wood from a further 4 separate violins by Stradivari and 2 other instruments. One, as mentioned, Pietro Giacomo Ruggeri of 1710, identified by my colleague Arjan Versteeg, and also a violin recently attributed to Alessandro Mezzalli. Interestingly, all those matching, for lack of a better word, Stradivari instruments were made in 1717, therefore shortly after the manufacture of the Messiah in 1716. Again, I hardly see this as a coincidence. These important correlations with violins from the Stradivari workshop represent the data from a 1717 Stradivari, recently rediscovered by Florian Leonard, as well as the Sacerno, the Windsor Weinstein and the Whitney Park Gillot, all these from 1717. I certainly don't want to take the credit for all these discoveries, as some had already been identified by John Topham during his earlier investigations, but I am unsure as to the reasons why these were ignored in the subsequent controversial debates, as John Topham's results had been peer-reviewed and published at the time. Their significance had patently been overlooked by those determined to challenge the Messiah's authenticity and pedigree, and in my opinion, as a consequence, seriously weakening their argument. I don't propose here to examine each and every one of the correlations obtained, although every single example deserves a thorough investigation. Just by the simple fact that they form the best results out of the entire database should be enough to convince any doubters that a relationship does indeed exist, even if it is only a relationship linking the wood of these instruments. And bearing in mind the objective process by which these were identified, they more than likely illustrate a highly probable same-tree association between these instruments. And even in the unlikely event that these represented the wood of 4 different trees, albeit all coincidentally used during the very same period, as their growth occurred concurrently, so did that of the wood found on the Messiah.